Hey, good day, everybody, and welcome to your Rouxbe Live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Rouxbe, as well as one of your chef instructors in the courses. And today it's my office hours. I'm glad you could stop by and field your questions, or have them fielded, I guess I should say, as well as just listen in. As we move through the list today, I'm looking at them already on the right-hand side of the page. I would like to ask you to participate, to the extent that you're comfortable, either with comments or questions. And you can do so by entering your question or comment in that upper right-hand corner dialog box that says Add Question Here. And that'll make its way to the list on the right-hand side of the page. And the other thing that I'll mention is that as you look at the individual questions that are already populated, you'll see a heart-shaped icon. And if you like that question in particular and want me to answer it sooner than later, go ahead and click on that icon, and it'll push that question up in priority. Okay, but as always, fear not, because I'll address the questions throughout the list here. Okay, and so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the selection of questions today. All right, and the first one is from Kenneth. Upon finishing this course, what would you recommend as far as another good vegan cooking course to look into? Also, best vegan recipe books and websites. I am not certain just offhand here which course you're currently enrolled in, Kenneth, but if you are in the Forks Over Knives course, then I think the next step for you would be the Pro Plant course. It's a whole food, plant-based course, and it delves into the FOK concepts deeper, as well as introduces a number of different topic areas for you to study and practice. Okay. Another course to consider is our Essential Vegan Desserts course, and that's taught by Fran Costigan. A wonderful class, great content if you've got the sweet tooth, and so you might consider that one. All right. Regarding other resources, I'm not up to speed necessarily on all the websites, but I think if you do a quick search, you'll find something that suits your personality, right, and the sort of cooking that you do. In terms of books, really the same sort of thought comes to mind, but I will share one title that I had just behind me here, and this one is by Chad and Derek Sarno. It's got a bunch of great photographs and some really fun ideas around plant-based dishes, preparations that you don't see in the mainstream blogs, for example. So check out Wicked Healthy. All right. Thank you. All right, next up, we got a question from Tony. Do you feel Seitan is okay to make and eat on a whole food plant-based diet, or is it best to just avoid it completely? This is a question that comes up occasionally. In my perspective on Seitan is that it's a lot like bread. And so if you think about how bread fits into your dietary lifestyle, consider Seitan in a similar way. And in terms of its degree of refinement, in terms of the extent that you can doctor it up with other ingredients and tailor it to a meal or to the texture that you prefer. So I think in that sense, like any food, really, it can be a part of a balanced diet, but it's going to be up to you to think about how much, and I guess ultimately if you want to enjoy Seitan or not. All right, thank you. And we have the next question. What are chef's secrets for getting a delicious dish of green vegetables out to the table, nice and hot and deliciously flavored? I just can't seem to master this. Well, let me share a couple of things here. The first thing that comes to mind is that these less dense vegetables and a lot of greens fall into this category. They cool down very quickly. Okay. And so it's going to depend upon, of course, the ambient air temperature, in your dining room or wherever you're enjoying your meal. And also if you can cover the dish to hold in heat, that's going to help. Consider heating the service vessel before putting the food into it, so that you're not pulling heat out of the vegetables immediately to heat that service vessel. Also in restaurants, if there's one so-called secret, or just a little insight as to what happens in restaurants, it is that we consistently use heated plates. Otherwise, we would face the same issue, that is cold food in restaurants. And so that's something you can do at home. You can heat your plates. When I do that on occasion, I'll use in the oven heated to the lowest temperature, which is for my oven 170 degrees Fahrenheit, which is still pretty hot. I might just heat that up partway, or otherwise I will turn the oven off with some lead time, so that it's a falling oven, and then place the serviceware in there, and then keep a finger on it so you can pull the serviceware out as needed, so that it doesn't get too hot. Okay. In terms of flavoring, that's really going to depend upon your palate preference. And if it's something really easy, very quick, you might saute the item in a bit of oil to the extent that you're comfortable with, and then you can add some garlic. I like to bloom mustard seeds in that oil, and then add the greens. Oftentimes I'll blanch the greens or par cook the greens so that I can add them to the pan just to finish. It gives me more control over the timing as I reach service time. Okay. I also, in terms of bringing flavoring to an item like this, I like to leave some flexibility with the individual diners at the table. And so with that in mind, I will often put some sort of a dipping sauce rather than cook the product in the flavorful ingredients. And so it could be a creamy sauce, or whatever your preference is in terms of a dipping sauce. In that way, people can either eat the product plain, right, lightly dress it, or maybe more heavily dress it according to their palate preference. All right, try those things and see what you can do. Thank you. All right, next question. I am afraid to hone my new knife because I don't want to ruin it with improper technique. Any suggestions? Should I just keep getting it sharpened if I'm not comfortable honing? Is it possible to tell if your technique is good or not? So the first thing that comes to mind is to watch our lessons on knife handling, knife maintenance, and practice. I mean, at some point you got to practice, right? Now, if you've got, let's say, an old knife, or one that you're not so afraid of dinging up a little bit, practice on that. And in terms of how to tell if your technique is good enough, if your knife gets sharper than it was, then your technique is probably pretty good. If it stays the same or gets dull, which is a real possibility, then you got to work on your technique. All right. And your middle question here, shall I keep on sharpening it? No, I think it's probably best to use the equipment as it's intended. When we sharpen knives, we take off relatively more metal from the knife, and it will simply wear down faster. So it's not necessary to sharpen a knife too frequently, right? Instead, we use the steel and the honing technique for daily maintenance. And I'd recommend working on the steel at least once a day. All right, thank you. All right, next up, we have a couple of questions from Laura. What are good healthy oils for baking, and what oils are good and healthy when it comes to frying? Um, my considerations, first of all, when I am baking is the fat that I'm using compatible flavor-wise with the finished product that I desire. So some oils come with very rich flavors, and they may not be what you want in the finished product. Okay. And then the other thing that comes to mind when frying is the smoke point. Frying, we fry at different temperatures, but often it's at 350, 375, somewhere right in there, degrees Fahrenheit. And we need to have an oil that has a smoke point that is comfortably higher than that. Okay, so that we can avoid burning of the oil, and otherwise, generally what we call the breakdown of the quality of the oil, which will shorten the shelf life, or the use life, I should say, of that fryer oil or frying oil. Okay, now in terms of healthy, I'll leave that up to you, right? There are many opinions across a broad spectrum regarding oil and healthiness. Now, more refined oils have less of the interesting components than less refined oil, which still contains more of its goodness, right, from the earth. But there are some trade-offs, right? If you want a higher smoke point, you probably need a more refined oil. And in the case of baking, if you want a more neutral oil, often that is a more refined oil. So I think probably the more important question to consider, at least in my opinion, is how much oil am I consuming, right, across the day, across the week, across the month. And, if you're going to make some baked goods, enjoy them for what they are, but don't over-enjoy them. If you're going to enjoy fried foods, probably in moderation would be the best approach. All right. Thank you. All right. Part 2 from Laura. I've just recently started to use a chef's knife, and I'm practicing to improve my skills. I would love to have your advice on how to best align the knife blade along with my body, arm, and hand positioning. What strategies can I implement? Aha. So the first thing that comes to mind is to remain calm. No, I'm kidding. To remain comfortable, right, in your positioning of all of your body parts. And when we set up a cutting board, it's typically, running in line, right, with the countertop. So the edge of the cutting board is parallel to the counter edge, right? That's our starting point. And when we cut an item, very often it's comfortable to cut that item in line with the cutting board, right? Parallel kind of to that side-to-side orientation of the cutting board, which means that we need to rotate our body a little bit in order to make that happen. Okay, otherwise our arm comes, if our body is kind of square with a cutting board, our arm comes at an angle, and we cut at an angle across the cutting board. So in order to straighten that up, we rotate the body. I hope you can see this on the camera here. Okay, and otherwise, assume the best positions in terms of your guide hand and your hand on the knife. Maintain as low stress or as little tension as you can through your neck, your shoulders, your arms, your hands, your wrists, down through your hips, your knees, all the way to the floor. Okay, and even provide a little bounce right in the knees and hips. And that's the starting point that I would recommend. Now, the next thing to do is to take a look at the position of your knife. And in order to make cuts that are most visually appealing and consistent, your knife you probably want your knife perpendicular to the cutting board. All right. And so sometimes we have to get over the knife and look down at it and make adjustments right as needed. And then with the subsequent cut, we now have 2 adjustments. One is to see that the knife is perpendicular to the cutting board. And the second thing is to see that that second cut is going to be parallel to the first. And it just takes some time. Okay. I will also mention for everybody out there that developing precise knife skills is really, really difficult. In fact, it's probably just not something that most people are going to even bother with, frankly. Okay. Among our assignments, the knife skills assignments are the most technical because the outcome is so specific. And therefore, those are the most challenging assignments, in my opinion. Okay. But with that in mind, just understand, what the function of certain knife cuts are in terms of the shape as well as the size. It affects the rate of cooking. It also affects the perception of the food on the palate, and also the way those food items might carry flavor to the palate. And so you want to judiciously choose your shapes and sizes. Of course, there's visual presentation as part of that as well, and that can be very important. It also depends on the context. Okay, and I'm going to come back to your question proper, and just say, in summary, practice some of those things I mentioned in terms of body alignment, staying stress, low stress, low tension, and pay attention to your hand and knife positioning, and just work slowly at first, work on accuracy, and then slowly introduce speed. Okay, with speed comes a decrease in accuracy. That's just the way it works. Okay, so there's a trade-off, and you get to figure out that balance depending on the context. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Matthew. I'm trying to watch my costs. One problem I'm running into is how to best keep produce fresh. Do you know a website reference material that is specific to each type of produce that describes how to best keep it, whether in the fridge, in a wet towel, on the counter? My quick answer is no. I don't have any websites that come to mind or references that come to mind, but I think on the interwebs, you're bound to find some resources with a little bit of reading, okay, that'll suit, the questions that you're asking here. The other thing that I'll mention is that a big part of preserving produce is to buy in quantities that are aligned with your usage rate. And that's a common issue, whether we're talking about a home kitchen or a professional kitchen, is to think about realistically what our usage rates are for each item in our inventory, especially perishable items, and to understand that those usage rates fluctuate as well, and that you may need to make adjustments as needed. Okay, but certainly, generally speaking, the refrigerator will slow down metabolic activity, so it extends the shelf life. However, the relatively cool temperature is damaging to some items. Bell peppers, for example, can start to develop little white spots that are usually due to the cold temperature. Also, some delicate leafy items like herbs, for example, can be damaged from the cold. Another thing to remember is that the refrigerator is a fundamentally drying environment. That's just what refrigerators do. And so it will dehydrate your food as soon as you place it in there. It starts that process. So it's good to protect the food, as you have noted, Matthew, by covering it with a towel. And in order to sort of reintroduce some of that lost moisture, a lightly damp towel works with many items. Okay, so some of this might be trial and error on your part, but otherwise you can find some information online. Thank you. All right, next question. Can you talk about advantages and disadvantages of cast iron cookware in whole food plant-based cooking? Yeah, I don't know of any, okay. Disadvantages versus, let's say, stainless steel. Cast iron is a little bit more high maintenance, or maybe I should say it requires a little bit more maintenance. But that's not a big deal to me. I think cast iron is quite fine to use in terms of Advantage, maybe it provides some iron in your diet in some cases, probably not the enameled cookware. But otherwise, I don't have a whole lot else to say. I think cast iron is a wonderful medium to use when cooking. It's just a matter of practicing, as it is with any material that you're using: stainless steel, copper, clay, cast iron, anything that you might be using. You just have to get used to how to cook with it. All right. Thank you. And next, Michelle asks, is there a cheese substitute other than nutritional yeast and a substitute for apple cider vinegar? Do you think we would have use for an air fryer? I've been thinking of purchasing one. So regarding cheese, I think it depends on what the context is. If you're talking about cheese itself, then I would direct you toward a couple of different places. One is the plant-based cheese section of the grocery store, and see if you can find something that you like. And then the other option is to make it yourself. And now, if it's sort of that complex umami flavor, that taste that we get from cheese, that can be a little more difficult to replace, again, depending on the context and just what your expectations are. But, you might try miso, and I would suggest a white miso to begin with, and see how you like it. And then regarding apple cider vinegar, again, I don't know the context here, but the first thing I would say is try a different vinegar. If vinegar in general is the issue, then try a different acidulant, right? Or, source of acid, meaning a lemon or a lime. It could be tamarind. It could be kokum. There are, a handful of ingredients that I use on a regular basis that provide acidity to my food. All right. And as far as an air fryer goes, air fryers are fine if that fits, your lifestyle. Then check it out. I think, like so many of these appliances, it's a matter of practicing and learning how to use it. You still have to learn how to cook in the air fryer. It's it gets hot, and you got to flip things over and stir things and that sort of thing. It's kind of like a mini oven, a convection oven, in my experience. But it just takes practice on your part. But otherwise, it can be a fine appliance to use. All right. Thank you. Next up from Priya. See, can you offer tips on cooking with wine? For example, when to add to the cooking process? Well, this is a fun topic and a big one as well. I'll share a couple of quick thoughts that come to mind. And the first one is that most of the time, and by far the majority of time, we're adding wine to deglaze the pan. So it's going to be relatively early. Well, I guess it depends on what we're making. If it's something that's going to be built up in the pan like a stew, then it's going to come early in the process, right after some initial browning of ingredients. We've got some souks that are maybe adhering to the pan. We need some moisture to lift those off the pan before we proceed to the next step. This is when a flavorful liquid is very helpful. And you're asking about wine. And so this is where wine can play a role. And then we let that wine reduce, usually pretty heavily, at least 50%, sometimes much more. And in order to reduce the volume, that's a big part of that. And also alters the flavor at the same time before we can build up all those other flavorful ingredients and have that wine meld into that process. Okay, so it's pleasant in the finished product. Very often when we add wine, just add wine very simply at the end of a cooking process, it doesn't have a chance to really change in the same way that adding it early on and reducing it does. And it leaves a winey note in the finished product, which is often not what we're looking for. Hence, we work with wine early on in the process. Okay. Now, Priya, I realize you come from the plant-based side of the world here, but I want to make a couple of comparisons to the general cookery world, because this is where we take a lot of our cues in the plant-based world. Okay, so when we're working with sauces like a dessert sauce, like a zabaglione or a sabayon, where we're adding a sweet wine to an egg base, right, lightly cooked, in this case over a bain-marie, we're adding that, in a very pronounced way, because the wine is going to be a major flavoring component of that sauce. It's not cooked for very long after that, certainly not over robust heat. Now, if we take that in the plant-based world, what might that look like? I'm not sure. I haven't played with kind of a sabayon alternative, but maybe a nut puree, a cream of some sort could be amenable, to the addition of a sweet wine for that nice winey complex flavor that adds in a dessert sauce. You can also add wine as a component in a marinade. So you would add that up front in that case. All right. So hopefully those are some ideas that will get you going. All right. Thank you. Next up from Joe, are there any brands of rice recommended for low arsenic levels? I'll say that arsenic levels vary depending on the region and the soil of that place, and therefore levels can vary quite a bit. It's probably going to be worth your while to just read up on some of the research that's been done in this field. Okay, no pun intended. Thanks. All right, next up, what's the difference between ongoing access to the FOK course once finished versus the monthly fee? Well, regarding the course that you graduated from, you're limited to that course content for life. But if you want a monthly membership, then you have access to some different recipes. For example, I think that's probably the big thing. That's going to be a little bit different. There's some overlap in the recipe gallery, but yeah, that's the fundamental difference. Okay, that the range of information you have access to. All right, and the next question, can you please give us some good saute and sauce recipes? Thank you in advance. I am going to address this by sort of evoking the Rouxbe mantra, okay, and that is we want you to focus on the cooking methods rather than recipes per se. Okay, once you become comfortable with cooking methods and also the ancillary techniques that support cooking in the kitchen, you'll be able to handle any recipe that comes your way. And so really the recipe part of your question, which really is your question, is up to your creativity, up to your palate preference, up to the seasonality of foods, for example. Okay. But in terms of, some of my personal preferences, I lean toward Asian flavors generally. That reflects my upbringing, as well as my current life. And, soy sauce and kaffir lime and lemongrass and spices that might show up in a curry of some sort are the sorts of flavors that I will reach for when it comes to a saute. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, I'll finish off greens by first blooming some spices, even just black mustard seed with a pinch of salt can add a really interesting boost of flavor. Okay, so give that a try, first focusing on developing your skills around the cooking methods. Thank you. All right, Diane asks, any recommendations on cutting board composition? My simple advice is avoid particularly hard surfaces. I have seen cutting boards made of glass as well as stainless steel, and I don't prefer those. but just about anything else is fine. I've got natural fiber boards at home as well as plastic boards, and there are other more high-tech composites on the market. I think they're all fine. I'm not too finicky about the cutting boards. Thank you. All right, from Miriam. I have trouble digesting onions and garlic. What can I substitute? One consideration would be a spice called asafoetida at your South Asian or Indian grocery store. It goes by the name Hing, H-I-N-G. And, this is sometimes used as a substitute for onions or onions and garlic. So give that a try. See how you like it. Thank you. And let's see, next question. In the preserving vegetable pigment lesson, it was recommended using an acid for the blueberries in the pancake batter. What acid is used when being plant-based? No dairy. A little touch of vinegar could work. Rice vinegar, apple cider vinegar come to mind for me. And, not so much that it turns your food sour, but just enough that you get the reaction that you want. All right. Thank you. And from Georgie, I am registered for the Forks Over Knives course, which begins on Feb 23, and I plan to take the professional courses over time. If I've already finished the modules in the FOK series, will I get credit for them in the professional program? No. You will not receive credit for your Forks Over Knives work as you shift to the Pro Plant course, for example. Instead, in those handful of assignments that have an overlap between the two courses, we ask you to investigate that topic at a deeper level, okay? And, for the assignments, you're always, I believe, given options on the recipes, the practice recipes that you might use for the photo uploads. So I encourage students to try a different recipe. And certainly as time has passed, your understanding of food, your skill development, right, has changed. And, we will look for descriptions that are much deeper, much more nuanced, much more thoughtful in that way. And so the idea for you is to challenge yourself as you go through the advanced course, even when the assignment at hand is similar or in some cases the same. Okay, there's always an opportunity to learn better cooking. Thank you. And the next question. What are your favorite brands of olive oil to use? Also, is there a particular region you prefer for them to come from that tend to have a better flavor profile? I do not have a favorite olive oil brand. In terms of regions, no, I really don't have a favorite region either. If there's anything that I'm after, it might just be the general flavor profile of the olive oil. For example, a sassy, peppery, green sort of flavor that has a little burn in the throat versus a more ripe, mellow olive oil. But in terms of where they come from and the brand name, I don't have a preference at all. All right, thank you. Excuse me just a second. Well, that didn't help. Okay, let me see if I can proceed here. Next up, for Matthew again, knife maintenance. I got a very nice, expensive knife as a gift, and I noticed the instructions say, do not put in dishwasher, wash by hand. Do you know why that is? Does it damage the handle or the actual blade? Certainly, handles can be damaged by high temperature as well as exposure to the chemicals that are present in the detergents that are typically used in a dishwasher. Regarding the blade, chemicals can have an effect on the blade. The bigger issue that comes to mind for me is the possibility of the knife banging around against other things in the dishwasher, and hence dulling or even damaging the blade. And for everybody out there, regardless of the type of knife you use, I would suggest that you just do it by hand. As soon as you're finished using the knife, clean it and set it off to the side where you keep your knives. And then there's no concern when it comes to damaging knives or getting cut by a knife in the sink, for example. All right, thank you. And next from Beverly, what can you recommend for whole food, plant-based, kid-friendly meals? Aha! So this is a fun question, and what comes to mind for me, and I'm going to share my own experience at home, and that is, number one, to include the child in the food activity, the food prep, the cooking, to the extent that it's age appropriate, I would say, in terms of coordination and discipline. And that is going to create an emotional attachment on the part of the child, right, to the food item, a little more interest in what is being produced, and it eventually ends up on the plate at the dinner table. And not to mention the pride, right, of knowing that he or she contributed to the meal, that much more interest, right, in the food. And very importantly, the development of knowledge and skills, right, around food handling. Within this process, I encourage tasting from, that raw state all the way through cooking and to the table. Another thing that's been successful at home is to have our child taste all the food, whether it's just a little bit or not. And, that way over time, the child develops a sense, right, for the flavor and the taste associated with the food, plus all the other things associated with the food, texture and so on and so forth. I think also as the adult in that environment, it's important to really engage with what it is the child likes and, more importantly, doesn't like about a particular food, because very often it's not the taste or the flavor, that's the issue, but rather it's the texture. And that gives us the opportunity to use that same ingredient, but alter the texture, right? Or combine it with other ingredients in a way that is more enjoyable by the child. And so, in the case of our child, he has eaten everything that the adults have eaten ever since he started eating solid foods, basically. And I think that's probably the easiest way to approach that. But there's got to be some great investment on the part of the parent, of course, to really keep the child engaged with the food handling process, tasting process, and also the knowledge that comes around the eating process as well. All right, thank you. Next question. During COVID, I pick up my grocery store orders. I ordered 1 jalapeno for a recipe, and I received 1 pound. What can I do? Can I freeze them? Yes, you can freeze the jalapenos. You know that, as with most produce items, when you thaw the chiles, they're going to be a little bit softer, right, than the fresh version. So you'll want to think about using them, in that sort of a state, right? Also, what I tend to do when I receive a pound of jalapenos when I thought I was getting 1 is I'll turn it into salsa. And the salsa that I make is one where I poach the jalapenos, take the stems off, just put them whole into a saucepan, and then cover them with olive oil, just enough. So not too much oil, but just enough, and gently bring that up to a cooking temperature, a poaching temperature. And you don't have to cook it for very long. Just once it comes up to temp, maybe an additional 5 minutes or so is enough. And then put that whole mixture, the oil as well as the jalapenos, into a blender. And this is where a high-speed blender is very helpful. And then you'll spin it until it's emulsified. And then just adjust the salt to taste, and you've got a great salsa. The heat level will depend upon, of course, the heat level of the chiles, and that varies quite a bit these days, I find. Sometimes it's fiery hot, and sometimes it's not. And then that can be used on any sort of preparation where you might enjoy a salsa. Thank you. And next question, what's your advice for new food bloggers to stand out in the saturated field? I don't know. This question really goes beyond my scope of comfort here in terms of the food handling theme here during my live events. So you might take a look online. There's certainly a lot of resources I know on tips, right, on how to stand out in the field as a blogger. Thank you. And next from Sally. I have a silpat sheet I like to cook vegetables on, mostly without oil. I find it absorbs the smell of the food, and no matter how long I soak it or how much I wash it with soap, it retains odor for days. Any ideas on how to avoid this? One idea would be to try applying a baking soda paste to the surface to see how that pulls out aromas. Okay. And another one would be to, if what I'm reading is correct, that the odors will decline over time, maybe you just, you just wait until the odors work their way out and then come back to what it is that you want to use it for. Another idea is to perhaps use parchment paper, right, instead of a silicone baking mat. Just perhaps one of those will fit your context. Thank you. Next up from Cheryl. Do you have any recommendations for courses or sources for cooking Indian vegetarian food? Just off the top of my head, I don't, but I do know that there are many sources online for Indian cooking and Indian vegetarian cooking. Let me see here. One name that does come to mind is Tarla Dalal. And Tarla Dalal is the author of many vegetarian Indian cooking books. And I think once upon a time, she probably even had a TV series in India. You might see what her presence looks like online. Her first name is spelled Tarla. Last name Dalal is Dal. Tarla Dalal. So check her out. Thank you. And next up, would you recommend purchasing an Instant Pot? Deb, it's got to fit into your lifestyle. I think that's going to be the starting point. An Instant Pot is it's a pressure cooker, right? And but an electronic one. Pressure cookers are excellent. I use one here at home weekly, and they can be very handy, right, in cutting down the cooking time on these very dense items, legumes and whole grains, for example. So, in that sense, I like the idea of this sort of equipment, but it's got to fit into the way that you cook, or that, maybe that you want to cook. All right. Thank you. And I see that Patrick has put up tarladalal.com. Thank you very much. Next up from Violetta. How long will it take me to change my standard American diet? Wow, this is an entirely individual and personal question. And it just depends on where you are mentally and emotionally, right, on this path. And, I meet people that will change on a dime. And, just over the overnight, literally. In some cases, they clean house, and all of a sudden they're on this new path. Whereas other people will make a slow transition to it, and others will find some space in between. And it's going to be up to you just how you want to eat, right? How you want to incorporate whole foods that are plant-based versus having an occasional convenience food that's processed. A lot of this is emotional, right? A lot of this is based upon your memories of food, your associations with people and places and times in your history. And so, think about all of those things as you move down the path of transforming your diet in some way or another. All right, thank you. Next question. How do we give ratings on the recipes we make in the task activities? Kelly, the ratings are going to be accessed through our recipe gallery, which is on Rouxbe.com, rather than through the courses at present. Although you ask a very interesting question, and yeah, I'd be game to pass this suggestion on to our engineers for consideration. Thank you. And the next question, how to set up mise dishes. So mise en place, I'm guessing this means. Do you have a recommendation for a set of containers that make this step easier? What I use for mise en place at home, depending on the quantity, are a set of small stainless steel bowls that I brought back from India. And I've got a whole stack of them, and those are pretty handy. When quantities are a little bit larger, then I reach for what we call in the restaurant industry a deli container. And I have a lot of pint size and quart size deli containers at home. They come in other sizes as well. You can look for them online, or if you have a restaurant supply store nearby, you might pay a visit so that you can see all of the different choices that you have. But to look up deli container, and you'll see what I use. Thank you. And next up from Lisa. Hello. I'm currently enrolled in the professional cook certification and am learning so many valuable techniques and skills as a cook. My plan is to continue with the Pro Plant certification course. Can I overlap the courses? So I am understanding your question, Lisa, to mean that can I enroll in both at the same time? And yes, you certainly can. As long as you got the time and energy for all the work in both of those courses, you are welcome to do so. Thank you. And next question from Taylor. I want to start a food prep business for baby boomers with diabetes. Please share some whole food plant-based food ideas. Taylor, I would say, if you're enrolled in one of our courses, Forks Over Knives or the Pro Plant course, any of those recipes that you come across in those courses would be a great, place to start, right, in terms of offerings. If you intend to start a business, in the plant-based world, I would suggest that you take a look at the Pro Plant course. It's much more in depth, much broader in terms of the topics covered, and I think would be well suited to starting a small business. Okay. Otherwise, you might take a look at the Rouxbe recipe gallery for some ideas. A dish that always comes to mind for me that's a pretty easy preparation is very simply based on chickpeas. And you can certainly bring in other legumes in order to alter the recipe. But there are onions and garlic and plenty of other vegetables of your choice. This whole dish is bound with coconut milk, and then adjust the seasonings from there. And you're certainly welcome to bring in any other flavorings like lemongrass, or I like the addition of kaffir lime. and to take the dish into a certain regional flavor profile direction or another. All right, thank you. Next up, Deborah says, I've read that Julia Child raised the level of her counters because of her height. I'm tall too, and my back often acts from bending over the cutting boards and pots. Should counters be higher than standard height? If one is tall, this is a frequent issue. And I've encountered this among my culinary students on ground as well as in restaurants. And in those cases, we just stack up some cutting boards, or otherwise, if it's going to be a longer term solution, then you might consider, maybe a thick piece of wood that you can set your cutting board on just to lift all of that up. Because, otherwise a lot of tension comes in through the neck and shoulders, which can be uncomfortable over time. All right, thank you. Next up, ideally, how large should a cutting board be for chopping vegetables? What material do you prefer for the board? Any product suggestions? As far as size goes, the board that I use most often is about 12 inches by 18 inches. I also have a board that's twice that big if I'm prepping for, more than 3 or 4 or 5 people. And so that would be my recommendation. Material, I'm good on any materials, plastics, composites, or natural fiber. I steer clear of glass and stainless steel cutting boards. Amazingly, those do exist. I don't have any brand selection or suggestions, any product suggestions. Whatever suits your budget, give it a try. Thank you. And Jill writes, are there any nonstick cookware that's okay to use? Totally up to you, right? And I say this not facetiously, but rather if one has a concern around nonstick coatings and their effects on one's health, then the consideration, would be to just steer clear of nonstick pans. If one wants some suggestion on nonstick pans, I'll tell you what I do, and that is, first of all, I don't recommend buying a full set because nonstick pans will accumulate scratches over time and will become stick pans. And so therefore, I will supplement my pans with just 1 or 2 nonstick pans that I will pick up from the nearby restaurant supply store. And I, right now, am using a couple of pans from a company called Vollrath, Vollrath, Vollrath. It's a U.S. company that makes commercial cookware. And so this stuff is commonly used in restaurant kitchens. But again, the same issue around the coating would exist if one has a concern with that. All right, thank you. Next up, what kind of nonstick pan do you recommend besides cast iron? The surface of whatever I use seems to disintegrate or become less nonstick. Yes, I think I just addressed that, Dorothy, but I'll share one last thought, and that is that nonstick pans are disposable items in my mind, and therefore I just buy them one at a time, use them until they start to stick, and then I toss them. Thank you. And the next question, I'm cooking for someone in my home that has diabetes. The plant-based yogurt has more sugars than the non-plant-based yogurt. Why does it have more sugar? Is this something I should be concerned with? I don't know. I'm not familiar just offhand with the plant-based yogurts that are on the market. If you're cooking for a client with diabetes, I would be concerned with both sugar as well as added oils, which are also part of that bigger diabetes discussion. And I think it's definitely something to think about. All right. Thank you. Next up, I made homemade pasta for the first time and found that I had to add a lot of extra flour due to stickiness in the process of rolling and using my pasta maker, a KitchenAid attachment. Is this normal? It was also wrinkling and breaking a bit. Why? So when it comes to doughs, very often some adjustment is necessary based upon humidity, based upon the specific flour that's being used. And so the idea of adding some extra flour due to stickiness is not unusual, so long as it's not a very large amount, which would indicate that there might have been some misscaling or mismeasurement of ingredients to start with. The second part of your question, there was some breaking. What comes to mind for me is that the dough might have needed resting. And if we're talking about wheat-based doughs, in other words, your regular dough with gluten in it, then gluten needs to rest after being kneaded. And it needs to rest often multiple times in order to just relax. Otherwise, it has a tendency to tear. And so the dough can break, as you described. And so I would recommend, after kneading it until it's, I think it all comes together. If you see it visually starting to tear on the surface, it's time to rest, and you want to rest it for 30 minutes or 60 minutes or so. It'll be noticeably softer, and then you can proceed to the next step. If you notice that it gets tight again or starts to tear on the surface, then let it rest again for 30 minutes or so, and then come back to the dough. All right, thank you. And Sierra writes, are you aware of a good resource for tempeh recipes? Not offhand. I would have to do a Google search, and I think if you do a Google search, you'll find a lot of information on tempeh and a flavor profile that would suit your palate and the audience that you're cooking for. All right, thank you. And let's see, the next question, is it necessary to serve the final dish on white plates? So the white serviceware question is one that I get every once in a while, and here's my response. We ask that the food be presented on white serviceware because it is generally easier for us to see the details of your work. And if we can't see the details of your work, then we can't critique and score your assignment to the extent that we need to. And if it's due to patterns on the plate or a color on the plate that interferes with your food item, then we will deduct points accordingly. And in some cases, we will ask the student to redo the assignment. So we feel it's necessary that the final item be served on white serviceware. Thank you. And Ellie asks, what blender is best? Should I invest in a Vitamix? Best is a relative term, and it's one that ultimately you get to decide on. But Vitamix is a good product. Blend Tech is a good product. Those have been the two that I have used most in my personal and professional cooking. And so those are the ones that I'm familiar with. I would recommend either one of those two brands. There are, I think, some others to choose from in the the high-speed blender category, but I'm not aware of them. You might take a look at some consumer reviews and also compare specifications between different models, because there are many to choose from, even within the Vitamix family or within the Blend Tech family. One thing to keep in mind is that, generally speaking, a larger motor is better. But there's also some literature out there, I think, that's worth reading that talk about how the power of the motor is translated to the actual processing of the food, which isn't always in a sort of an obvious way. Okay, so some studying on your part is necessary, and that will lead you to your answer. Thank you. And next up, what would be your tips to using cast iron pans into the daily kitchen? How to know when it's ready to cook? Yeah, good question here. I think the first one, cast iron in the daily kitchen. First of all, no problem, right? Cast iron will do what any other cookware will do, and even with a buildup of some nonstick seasoning qualities. Okay. In terms of tips, the first one would be to practice so that you get to know how long it takes to heat up and how long the pan holds heat, which can be, very, very different from stainless steel, for example. And then, also regarding, when's it ready to cook? You can, I say feel the process, which means use your hands, feel the heat on your face, and you're going to get to know over a period of time, in other words, with experience, how hot your particular pans are for a given cooking application. And, you can use the water ball or mercury ball test to a limited extent. It doesn't look the same as stainless steel because the surface of cast iron is more porous, and so the water tends to sputter about and it doesn't roll around as smoothly as it would on a stainless steel pan surface. But you can sort of use that to begin to gauge the heat, but we need to move past that as well. And this is where the feel of the heat, again, on your hands and on your face is very helpful. And I find that I will put my face down close to the pan in order to gauge, right, on the more sensitive skin, right, of the face, the heat of the pan. And so that's my advice. Practice and really engage with that process. All right. Thank you. Next up, I'd like to prepare plant-based meals for backpacking. My inclination is to dehydrate meals in order to save weight and time in preparation in camp. What method would you recommend, and what dehydrator would you suggest? Lori, you're getting into an area that is pretty specialized in as far as food prep goes, and not one that I've got a lot of experience in. So I really can't comment on how to prepare dehydrated meals for camping. In terms of dehydrators, once again, I would direct you toward consumer reviews on popular brands. Generally speaking, in terms of the design, is one where the fan is located in the back of the unit so that it can send air fairly evenly over each of the trays that are inside the unit as a whole. Okay, but in terms of a brand name and a size of many to choose from, take a look at specifications and consumer reviews to find something that will fit your needs. Okay, in terms of quantity. All right, thank you. And next up from Rita. Can you please tell me how to cook okra with no oil technique on steel pots and pans? No oil, okra on steel. Okay, I'm going to suggest you introduce water in order to help keep the okra from sticking to the pan. And, in other words, it's a combination of a little bit of oil, which is going to generate steam at the same time. And then you can, let that water evaporate, start to develop some color on the food product. add some more liquid to the pan a little bit at a time to loosen it up if it's sticking. And you kind of work back and forth between those two states as you move through the cooking of the product. Okay. And then as you play on that line of the dry pan versus the moist pan, you can develop color. And that color is going to give you the better flavor and the eye appeal, perhaps, that you're looking for. Another consideration is to do some work in the oven, where you can use a high temp bake temperature, maybe 450 degrees. You can also use a broiler setting to introduce some intense heat for the browning as well. All right, so give that a try. Thank you. All right, next up, I've been using a melting dome to keep food warm for a short period of time. Just discovered this hack, and it makes me feel fancy. Awesome. Thanks for sharing this idea. I don't know what a melting dome is, but I'm going to find out right after today's office hours, because I'm curious now, because I want to feel fancy too. Thanks for sharing this idea, though. Next up, what, in my opinion, is the best way to cook dried legumes? I usually soak them. Not all of them require soaking in terms of their quickness of absorbing liquid, but usually I'm soaking them. And I just soak them overnight, so I don't have to worry about the time. And then I will very often cook them in a pressure cooker, if not a regular pan, in lots of water. In the case of a stovetop cook, it's going to be lots of water, a pinch of salt usually, and then I will cook it until it's just done. I will turn off the heat and let it sit in that liquid, in that water, and cool down a little bit, because it'll absorb liquid as it cools down. And this will draw that liquid into the center of the bean for a nice tender bean. Now, the pressure cooker, due to its pressurized environment, transforms the center of the beans in a slightly different way. You're going to get, in my experience, a creamier bean if it's done in a pressure cooker. Thank you. And next up, can you recommend how to create a soup using purple yam? I am inclined to, build a soup as you normally would, let's say, but add some diced yam, midway through the cooking process, so that it's fully cooked by the time the soup is done. And that's going to be the easiest way to do that. All right, just add it to the broth, right, or the liquid medium for cooking. And next up, what's the best way to fry lotus root? Let's see, lotus root. I like to dredge it with a little bit of flour, and lotus root has a nice crunch to it anyway, but if you wanted to add a little additional crunch, you can blend rice flour with a little bit of wheat flour, or you can use some potato flour as the dredging medium, and then you drop that in the fry oil. Now, lotus root can take a little bit of time to cook, so experiment with the thickness of the cuts. I'd recommend starting with thinner cuts first and just see how the heat penetrates relative to the browning of the dredging medium on the exterior. All right, thank you. And finally, from Tanya, I've enjoyed all the questions and answers. Thank you, Eric and Ruby team. Thank you very much, Tanya, and all of you that joined me today for my office hours. It's my pleasure to field the questions. I realize that there are some questions that really require a search online, and for those, I gave a pretty general answer. Otherwise, I'm glad you can join me today for my office hours, and I look forward to seeing you again to field your questions. Until then, happy cooking. Thank you.